Welcome to this special virtual event with Standards Australia, AustCyber, the Australian Cybersecurity Growth Network, and the New South Wales Government. My name is Chris Cubbage. I'm the Director and Executive Editor for My Security Media and the My Security Marketplace. It's a pleasure to host you here on the Marketplace with the Cybersecurity Taskforce, National Cybersecurity Capacity Building for Resilience 2020. We're going to hear from the Minister for Customer Service, the Honourable Dominello MP, Prerana Mehta, the Chief of Ecosystem Development for AustCyber, Dr. Jed Horner, the Strategic Advocacy Manager for Standards Australia, and Simon Bush, the General Manager for the Australian Information Industry Association. I'd like to give a welcome to country. We are recording this in Sydney, and to the Gadigal people, the traditional owners, and we pay our respects to their leaders past, present and emerging. The agenda for today, I did mention we are recording this particular session. It will be available on My Security TV and also as a podcast with the Cybersecurity Weekly podcast. We do welcome your questions. We are going to hear from each of the speakers. We're going to hear from the Minister first, then we'll hear from AustCyber and Standards Australia, and then the AWIA, and then we'll run a Q&A. Now, we do have a lot of registrations for this particular session, but you're welcome to type in your questions as each of the speaker presents, and then we'll run that Q&A as best we can. There's also a number of handouts available to you. I'll refer to those at the end of this session, but you can have a look at those also. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the Honourable Dominello MP, Minister for the New South Wales Customer Service.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. And can I also thank AustCyber and Standards Australia for their support of the task force, and My Security Media for hosting the task force today. In February this year, in a pre-COVID world, I know COVID was big overseas, but when it comes to Australia, we were still to understand the significance of it. I think I had one of my last face-to-face meetings in a pre-COVID world with AustCyber. It was in my boardroom just around the corner, and they said to me, look, we need to do more work nationally, of course, on the cyber issue. And I said, look, New South Wales is leading the country when it comes to digital transformation. There's no doubt about that. We definitely want to play a leadership role when it comes to cyber because we know how important it is. And I asked them, what are the 3 things that we really needed to do to improve the settings or the posture in cyber for New South Wales that could then lead the country, given our investment. And they said harmonisation, prioritisation and regionalisation. And I'll come to those 3 things in a moment. What happened after February? Well, obviously everybody got into the COVID mindset, and things have just evolved dramatically since that point. And in many ways, this cyber drive has become even more important, not just for New South Wales / Australia, but on the world scene, particularly as we've seen various forms of attacks, high-profile attacks in recent times. The attacks, as you would know, being part of this podcast, attacks occurring almost every minute of the day. But the appreciation of how important cyber is has definitely been elevated in the public narrative. We need to do more, definitely, and we definitely need to lead here in New South Wales because A, we understand how significant cyber is and our cyber muscle is, but also because we are moving so rapidly on the digital front. So we've obviously done the digital driver's license, we've done the e-conveyancing, the property, the planning, we're about to roll out e-construction, the transport's highly digital, and we're doing a whole lot of work on the e-health space, e-justice space. Wait till you see what we got in store for Service New South Wales, and more digital products and more digital services are going to be rolling out on that platform. That's very exciting. But what I'm trying to say is the government is absolutely focused on the digital world because we know that A, we can provide better services, but far more accurate services to the great people of our great state. So that's why we've announced a record $1.6 billion for a digital restart fund. Just about a month ago, we announced that. Now, that is a record spend in not just in New South Wales, but in Australian history. It is enormous how much money we're going to be putting into digital initiatives over the next 3 years. We've already earmarked of that 1.6 billion, about $240 million for cyber, because if we got all these digital initiatives rolling out, we need to make sure cyber is baked in, because we cannot deliver digital products and services unless we have trust. And trust, as I've said many, many times before, is built on a platform of privacy, security, which is cyber, transparency, open government, more data being opened up, and ethics. And cyber is just critical. So if we don't get that right, we lose trust straight away. So that's why we're putting $240 million into that. A bulk of the targeted 240 mil will be to develop uplift right across whole of government. So we've got pockets of excellence within New South Wales government, as you'd expect, and we've got Cybersecurity New South Wales up and running. Tony Chapman's doing a great job there, but we need to lift, all ships in the harbour, as it were, and we're going to do that by a focus, or through a focus on the ASD Essential 8. So that will be a primary focus for us. We've already started development on the new cyber security strategy, and we'll make sure that we align with the Commonwealth Cybersecurity Strategy when that's going to get released, I think in September, but definitely in the coming months. And we definitely encourage you to get involved and to help us shape it. If I can go back to those three things that AustCyber indicated to us in February that we really needed to drive to get us to a good place here. The first was in relation to prioritisation, i.e. We need to make sure we prioritise sovereign procurement, prioritise our procurement spend, so to make sure that it is sovereign aligned. And again, I don't need to indicate to this audience how critical that is. We talk about it a lot, but we're now going to do it. And I've set up a task force with Minister Tudorhope to look at procurement more generally, but specifically around cyber and the sovereign procurement piece. So that's going to be a very quick task force. I don't want this thing to go for months and years. We need to start spending the 1.6 billion. We're going to try and get $500 million out the door this year. So we need to hurry up and get that cyber sovereign posture right. And so that's why that task force is going to be pretty quick. The second piece we already started to work on, that's regionalisation. Again, AustCyber said to us, look, you can't throw all your eggs into the Sydney basket, as attractive as that is. We need to definitely work more on the regional play. And we've done that. So we've already announced that we're using regional Bathurst as the first piece of the pie there. So that's a natural place to go because you've got Charles Sturt University, you've got spatial services already there. It is already a harbour, a regional harbour for talent. So we can rapidly build out our cyber muscle there in Bathurst. But we're going to do some other regional pieces as well. But we just already started with Bathurst, which is great news. And the thing about building cyber in the regions is you're not just creating a job, which the regional MPs, all of them want more jobs in the regions, but you're creating an industry. A job might last a week, a month, a year, 5 years. Industries last generations. And that's why it's important that we build more regionalisation when it comes to cyber. The third thing is harmonisation. So again, the task force is well and truly underway. They've already had a number of meetings to make sure we get a harmonisation of the standards in place. So people can make informed decisions around the cyber products and services that they need to provide or acquire. So if I can just go down into the Cyber Standards Task Force, this is going to have a major role. And again, it's something that nobody's really tackled, but because New South Wales is leading digital and is now leading cyber, particularly because of our investment, I think it's incumbent on us to lead the way when it comes to standards. And that's why, again, I want to thank both AustCyber and Standards Australia for their leadership and their collaboration with our government, because this can't be just a New South Wales play. It has to be an Australian play in relation to standards. We will just take a lead role because of our size and because of our investment and because of our maturity in the digital space. It's in fact, we have an obligation to do it because of where we are. So in conclusion, I'd just like to thank everybody that's been involved in the task force and for the enormous interest that's been around this task force. That's reassuring and comforting, because it just means that we are definitely on the right track. I'm looking forward to your insights through the industries and how that plays into the task force, and more importantly, how that translates into a practical application as we set New South Wales and indeed Australia up for cyber success, indeed success more generally in the future. So thank you for having me.
Great. Look, thank you very much for inviting us to be part of this webinar, and thank you, Minister, for such a fantastic overview on why we're partnering with you, and the maturity and leadership that you mentioned as part of your presentation there is exactly why we're actually choosing to partner with New South Wales for this particular program. Look, I'm going to show my screen. Jed and I are going to do a bit of a tandem dance for you. We're going to go through our slide deck together because this program that we're kind of doing with New South Wales is actually being done hand in hand. And we're going to keep it fairly informal. So let me just show my screen for you. Here we go. I'm hoping that you can all see it. If you can't see it, let me know. So look, the New South Wales Cybersecurity Standards Harmonisation Project. I mentioned before, my name is Prerana Mehta. I'm the Chief of Ecosystem Development from AustCyber, and Jed Horner, he's the Strategic Advocacy Manager for Standards Australia. Look, we're both going to just talk a little bit about who we are and what each of our organisations are doing, and therefore why we're involved. And then we'll talk through exactly what the program is and the various elements for the program. We'll mention our timelines and how we're actually attacking the beast, so to speak. So firstly, AustCyber. Who are we? So we are a government-funded organisation, but we are independent of government. We're not an industry association, but we do represent industry. We have three really clear, simple objectives. Our job is to grow an Australian cybersecurity ecosystem, and we do that by providing support to all of the Australian cybersecurity sector, the majority of whom are SMEs. And there's very few Australian companies that are even over the numbers, I guess, the turnover, a large turnover, or a number of 100 employees, because our sector is very young. So we're still growing, and so there's a lot that we need to do to be able to provide the scaffolding, as it were, to be able to enable the sector to grow. Our second objective is to export Australia's cybersecurity capabilities to the world. And this is where the sovereign piece comes into play. So not only do we want to make sure that Australia is purchasing and supporting Australian capability and Australian technology, of which cyber is an element of it, but we also then want to be able to showcase our capability globally. And our role is to be able to assist that growth and that scaling to occur. And things like standardization is essential. If we can't standardize and harmonize nationally, then how are we supposed to compete internationally? And the third objective for us is to make Australia the leading centre for cyber education. Minister Dominello already talked about regionalisation, and he talked about not just creating jobs in the region, but actually creating an entire sector in the region. And jobs are really important. They need to be skilled and we need to be able to ensure that we've got a pipeline of appropriately skilled, cyber-aware, cyber-savvy employees in the workforce, not just within the tech sector, but across all sectors, because we need to actually build our resilience and build our posture in cybersecurity to be able to compete. So that's who we are. I'm going to throw across to Jed.
Thanks so much, Pete. Really appreciate that. I don't have slides on this particular note because it'll be death by slides, but that's a really lovely segue from your presentation and the exciting work the Minister outlined in New South Wales, which is, I think, world leading, it's fair to say. And I have to say, even the task force itself and its ambitions and its appetite also ticks the same box. We couldn't find anything comparative happening globally. So it's exciting to be part of this work, and I think it's immediately relevant to the Minister's point about working hand in glove with the feds and also internationally as part of supply chains, and then building up that sovereign capacity. So very excited to be here supporting that effort as well. In terms of our role, we're Australia's national standards body. That doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people, but we're essentially part of Australia's critical infrastructure. So we talk about that a lot in cybersecurity. We're beginning to use those analogies of infrastructure. And the work we do is setting standards in areas that would touch all of your lives. And I think primarily here of the work we do in infrastructure and building, which literally would shape all of the facilities you're sitting in today, from the Minister's office, where he's presenting from, to the room Prerana's in right now and myself, setting those physical requirements really and standardization around our daily lives. But we also have a footprint which some of you on the call will be highly aware of and others won't be, around technology standards too. So plugging in globally to bodies like the ISO and the IEC and to others in the European community, for example, and then bilaterally to shape standards around technology. And that's what's brought us to this piece today. So that ranges from cybersecurity to payments to digital standards more broadly, including file formatting and the like. And our job there is to connect Australians to the world. So I think to the Minister's challenge, and the Prime Minister has said this himself, our challenge as Australians now in this current world, and you can call it the post-COVID world where digital has become so pervasive, is to become standards makers and not just standards takers. And it is true, if you look through the expertise we have in Australia, we have people, and we've been talking to them over the past few weeks, who are so talented in terms of being able to turn frameworks into reality at the level of controls and the like, and governance frameworks. One of the challenges we've had historically is making sure that we then mirror that expertise globally. So I think one of the exciting opportunities the task force brings, and the work that we do as your national standards body, is to try and channel that Australian voice back, so that where all of you who are shaping best practice, and I know some of you on the call are doing just that, we can be a springboard there for action as well. So I thought I'd leave it there at a broad overview, but essentially we are your voice globally around standard setting, and equally we want to play a role in the Australian sector, all sectors across the economy, to set standards as well. And I'll leave it there, Pete.
Thank you, Jed. Do you want me to move to the next slide, or do you want me to keep that up for
Got
a
it,
little bit
actually.
longer?
I might actually just call out for people. We'll use that slide that we were just on before, if you could go back. Thanks, Chris. Just very briefly. I thought I would walk people through the broad overview of standards, because I know when we dive into this space, many of you rightly think about regulation and the way standards are used in those spaces. But I did also just want to very briefly paint a picture about how standards are used across the economy, which I think is important for the discussions we're going to have. And it's actually important because I want to allay any concerns that this is immediately a procurement or regulatory piece, which it's not. So standards can be used on a voluntary basis by industry. So that's just setting a common benchmark across supply chains in relation to specific products. And that's traditional free market use. We then have their inclusion in contracts, which is a second way, I suppose, standards come to life. And that's used traditionally in supply chains. So when we think about the commercial contracts all of you would sign, whether you are a supplier, you're looking to do major work as a prime, standards there are often referenced, and any lawyers on the call will know this, to manage the risk that companies have. And those might be standards around record keeping and data, and increasingly there might be standards around cybersecurity. So if you're in a regulated sector like healthcare and others, and banking, you might use standards in that sense to assure yourself and your customers that people down the line are actually doing due diligence and not just saying it. And finally, of course, there's regulatory call-up. And that's a whole nother kettle of fish. So as a national standards body, we don't lobby for that. That's not our role. Our role is not to create red tape. However, when standards are fit for purpose, state and territory and federal governments call them up. And that's when you get the mandating of standards. So I just want to paint that picture beyond our role to colour this conversation, and just to reassure people that in terms of the task force and its work, it's looking at those first two uses primarily, how it can help the market, and how we can do that through supply chains. And the Minister mentioned sovereign procurement. That'll come into play as well. And the final piece, of course, is the area where government plays. So our state colleagues, led by Tony Chapman, and our federal colleagues in Home Affairs and the like, would be the people who look at the call-up of standards. So I just wanted to outline that for everyone on the call, mainly to allay any fears you might have. But I think it's also really good to colour this, because people use the word standards in a really loose way, and I think having some clarity is often helpful. Thanks, Pete.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, so look, this slide really tries to paint a picture of everything that's out there in cybersecurity. And it's quite clear that there's a lot already going on. So where we started with thinking about standards was what's already out there? What's out there currently that has an impact on Australia? So we have right at the top there the ACSC, so the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. They are really responsible for things like the Essential 8. And the Essential 8 is being applied predominantly across critical infrastructure, but also across a number of sectors, and tier 2, tier 3 companies as well. Then there's the MITRE framework, which is out of the US. There's ISO standards that I guess everyone is aware of, and they can become quite complex and complicated depending on what sector that you're operating in. The UK, for example, the GCHQ uses their own national cybersecurity standards as well. The NIST standards, again, out of the US, and the NICE standards that sit underneath that for cybersecurity skills and workforce development, for example, are other security standards that are being used. And the NIST standards, interestingly, are currently being reviewed. And Australia's actually provided some input into that review so that we can kind of try and globalise some of the use of those standards. CIS is another one of those standards. It focuses quite a lot actually on the benchmarks and best practice, which I'll bring up again because that's one of the reasons why we're doing this program at the moment. We've talked about Australia's cybersecurity strategy, and that's kind of happening right now. So we're hoping that the national strategy will be released in the next couple of weeks potentially, and that's probably going to give quite a lot of guidance again on what government and what industry are going to be needing to do in order to be able to increase our cyber posture. And lastly, there's the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification, which has come out of the US, and this is all fairly new. So a lot of people are still getting their heads around it, but the CMMC, as it's fondly called, will be a requirement. The other things too that I noticed that was coming out of the US last week was a bill that had been put up that suggested that over a number of years, I think it was 8 to 10 years time, all government procurement has to have, I think, close to 90 or 100% going through a local provider. So that's a US provider. So how does that impact us? And how do we need to make sure that we're complying? So there's some of the questions that we started looking at as part of this project. Oh, and Jed, I should probably ask, was there anything else you wanted to add before I move on to the next slide?
No, I think that covers all bases. Thanks, Pete.
Brilliant. Okay. So I think the minister actually mentioned 3 things. He said we wanted to talk about harmonisation, we wanted to talk about prioritisation, and we wanted to also address regionalisation. Those 3 things don't occur independently. What we found was that they're actually incredibly well integrated. And without standards, you can't do the prioritisation piece. Without prioritisation, you can't really do the regionalisation piece, and vice versa. So this piece is not independent. It is actually designed to be in step with the other priorities that the New South Wales Government is trying to address. For the harmonisation standards piece, really what we're trying to do is embed industry-led cyber standards across New South Wales and from New South Wales bleeding out nationally. What we're trying to do is we're convening government and industry to accelerate the adoption of a harmonised set of standards for cybersecurity in Australia. And how we're doing that, we're bringing together industry, we're bringing together other governments, so it's not just New South Wales, it's New South Wales listening to what other state governments are doing, as well as what federal government is doing. We're working lock in step, with Standards Australia, who are going to help drive the development of these cybersecurity standards. And we're really listening to industry, because industry are the ones that are currently faced with a myriad of standards, advice, compliance, regulation that they're trying to work through. And what will we have as a result? Well, we're hopefully going to have a framework. And that framework will be sector specific. It will provide standards and guidance around how we can become more competitive. Jed, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, that's right. And just to underscore, the point of this is to leverage private sector expertise. So we recognise, as with any economy and every sector of the economy, there's going to be laggards and there'll be people who are best in class. And we know that in Australia, a lot of our sectors in financial services, healthcare, already are leading the way in terms of the defence of cybersecurity, including the use of standards. And we wanted that to be the starting point for government interventions too, because to be frank, when you're spending all that money and all that time to get things right at an enterprise level across your whole organisation, we think you should be listened to before we start talking about other forms of regulation or developing new standards.
Absolutely. Okay, so look, this is a little bit of a mud map. What we wanted to try and do here is paint a picture of how we're tackling this particular program. So we're looking at what global standards currently were in place, and you saw the diagram that I put up previously. What we're finding too is that a number of sectors that don't have clear direction are either asking for it or are kind of making it up as they're going along. And by making it up, I don't mean that they're just coming up with a standard. What they're trying to do is beg and borrow from what's occurring across other sectors or what's happening globally. So what we are trying to do is bring everything together, find out what the gaps are, find out what works and what's currently being used and what's effective, and then create a minimum standard or a benchmark or a starting point. And that benchmark needs to be fit for purpose. So there's absolutely no point in us saying, well, you must do this when the sector doesn't agree with it and it's not going to be easily applicable. The 6 sectors that we're going to be focusing on are health, energy, IoT, which also includes data, defence, financial services and education. And you can see that underneath each of those sectors, there's, I guess, a varied degree of maturity. In some sectors, such as the financial services sector, there's actually clear regulations, such as the APRA 234, that allows companies to understand what their minimal requirements are. In other sectors, such as IoT, there's a lot under development, and of course we'll be hearing more about that in a moment. And it's around kind of understanding and working through each one of those. So together with business leaders across each of these priority sectors, we were going to review what these standards are. And at the end of that, we're going to have an improved uptake of industry-led cybersecurity standards across Australia. Jed, anything further to add on that one?
I was going to say also, at the very least, have a ready source of information for new market entrants too. You know, the Minister spoke about sovereign procurement. As people enter those global supply chains, what we want to do is disentangle this information for them in very blunt terms. So at the moment, you know, Prerana and I were on a defence talk, a roundtable last week, try to unpack the layers of complexity. So it is very easy, for example, for a government or other stakeholders to say, we want a particular sector to be a focus for us. What we're trying to do through this task force is then map what needs to happen for a business to effectively do business across borders, which is the growth agendas governments are articulating. So this piece of work will be highly practical in that sense, because we're already starting at that base where everyone's on different levels, but people have some very detailed experience, and we're trying to map that. So actually it becomes easier for market entrants, for businesses based in, for example, New South Wales, to actually understand what they need to do from the beginning and not retrofit from the end, in blunt terms. Thanks, Pete.
Yeah, brilliant. And I'll let you speak to this one as well if you'd like.
Yeah, great. Look, in terms of process, because I know that's a question many of you will have. Many of you might have the question, and I know we're going to Q&A in a short while after Simon's spoken as well. But the process for this particular project. So the Minister launched it in June. I think we had some really good media coverage and certainly some interest given the focus and the timing of that. As the Minister said, off the back of some major breaches, data breaches and security issues that have been flagged. We did some initial mapping. So we spent time actually as a group. Not all of us as cyber experts will freely admit that, but many of us as policy wonks, so people who've talked to plenty of lawyers and people in the commercial space to know what's being used where. And we mapped the standards that are in use at a very high level. So we went back to legislative frameworks that drive, for example, health or financial services. So what's relevant to you in New South Wales in relation to patient data, for example, and then we map through the standards that are being applied commercially, largely through supply chains, and some of the regulated ones too, if we look at finance. So we've done all that mapping work, which we're sharing sector by sector through roundtables. Those roundtables are from people who are nominated, so we also welcome that engagement, by the way. We've been adding people to roundtable sessions as we go. There's many more to go, and there'll be a long process. As is listed in front of you, we've got those roundtables happening now and into early August. That's an initial listening exercise, but I have to say we've been very impressed by the level of engagement. Education and defence was last week, really, really high levels of not only literacy of standards, because these are the experts, of course, but people who can talk to the various challenges they're facing. What we're looking for from those roundtables too, to the point I've made before, is we've obviously got parallel processes in place. We've got the Standards Harmonisation Taskforce, very much staying in our lane, focusing on what we're doing. We've also got the Minister through his department and people like Tony Chapman driving some great work around policy, including the updated cybersecurity strategy for New South Wales. So we're capturing your ideas when you have them around not just standards, so gaps that might exist, and we make no assumptions, what works well, what's relevant to specific sectors. We're also capturing grand ideas that people have. And I have to say, last week we had 3 or 4 really, really useful ones already come through. So we're sharing those with government. We're capturing them all in those sessions as well. So don't feel like you just have to focus on standards. Finally, this will all culminate in the development of a framework. So people have called this in our sessions a framework of frameworks. Completely get that, and that's probably a good description. If you're looking at how standards in certain sectors are ready to be used at a broad level, enterprise level, that'll be the focus. So this piece will be a public-facing document, which will actually, I think, for one of the first times in a non-proprietary way, so open to the public, demonstrate and show the standards you would need to consider in specific sectors. And of course, that's a lot of detail. So I'll leave it there. That's probably all you need to know in terms of our process. But as I said, when we get to Q&A, please do chime in. Please also do reach out to Prerana and myself. As I said, we've been handling queries and we've been engaging people. So please do reach out if you're looking to be involved. I'll leave it there, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good for both of you. So we're going to hear from Simon Bush, General Manager for the Australian Information Industry Association. We're just going to swap over the slides now to Simon, coming over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Look, thank you for this opportunity, and thanks to AustCyber Standards Australia and Minister Dominello for the leadership he's showing in this space. It'll be a short presentation, 9 slides, on why cyber matters through an industry lens. I'll give some data on the scale of cyber attacks in industry, to put into some context, talk about our white paper, which we had recommendations on cyber, and then I'll finish on the Standards Task Force and what that means from an AWIA perspective. So for those hearing about us for the first time in this webinar, the AWIA was formed in 1978. Our membership is diverse, including many SMEs, including cybersecurity firms, I might add, leading Australian ASX-listed tech and telco companies, as well as multinational software vendors, data centre providers, and both local and multinational cloud platforms and professional services firms. My remit is to ensure we work cooperatively and proactively with governments to ensure they understand the increasingly complex and interconnected digital economy. We aim to promote policies that support economic growth, jobs and exports, as well as lead policy debates on areas like digital ethics, data privacy and standards. We need to move on from calling Australia's economy the digital economy, as we now have digital at the core of our industries. with more tech jobs now being created outside of the tech industry itself. So why is cybersecurity and cyber resilience critical to our members? The data that we do have indicates the scale and constant state of cyber threats industry is facing. The Australian Cybersecurity Centre evidence before Senate estimates in March this year gave some insight into this scale when it said, and this is quoting their data, since 1 July last year, the ACSC has responded to over 1,275 security incidents and an average of more than 5 incidents per day. Following the establishment of the ACSC's new online cybercrime reporting tool, Report Cyber, on 1 July 2019, over 36,000 reports of cybercrime have been received. That's an average of 145 reports a day, or more than 1 report every 10 minutes. The scale and impact of cybercrime activity in Australia during the July to September quarter of 2019 was detailed in its Cybercrime in Australia report. Over this time, individuals and small to medium enterprises self-reported financial losses to Report Cyber of more than $890,000 each day, representing estimated annual losses to cybercrime of $328 million. Remember, this is reported data only, so the actual figure, I dare say, would be actually a lot higher. Many on this call would recall the Toll cyber ransomware attack, which greatly affected this business, its revenues, and its reputation. This serves as a timely and stark warning of how industry needs to take these issues seriously. The ACSC also worked closely with Toll Group at their behest in relation to this ransomware incident. You can also see in the slide 2 recent examples of reported cyber incidents with hackers targeting supply chains in defence, often going after smaller companies with more lax controls, and government reports of Russian malicious cyber activity aimed at COVID vaccine research. So our universities, logistics companies, utilities, banks, governments and SMEs are all known targets. This is an issue for all companies, both large and small, and the data shows Australian companies and institutions are under threat every minute of every day. Industry needs to also be aware of the Notifiable data breaches scheme that was established in February 2018 to improve consumer protection and drive better security standards for protecting personal information. The latest data from the AWIA, which is the Office of Australian Information Commissioner, covers the 6-month period between July and December 2019 and shows a 19% increase in the number of data breaches recorded. This is obviously pre-COVID, and it'll be interesting to see what the next report shows. This report shows that 537 breaches were notified under the scheme, up from 460 in the previous 6 months. Malicious or criminal attacks, including cyber incidents, remain the leading cause of data breaches, accounting for 64% of all notifications. Repeat, cyber and criminal attacks account for 64% of all notifications. Data breaches resulting from human error account for 32%, down from 34%. The health sector is again the highest reporting sector, notifying 22% of all breaches. Finally, human error caused 43% of data breaches in the health sector, compared to an average of 32% across all notifications. I was asked today to talk about cyber resilience and industry. So let's define these. Cybersecurity and cyber resilience are distinct concerns, and understanding the difference by industry is key to preparing an effective response to cyber threats. The misconception that a cybersecurity program can substitute for cyber resilience is potentially disastrous. While cybersecurity focuses on keeping attackers out, cyber resilience aims instead to minimise the mayhem caused by attackers who do manage to penetrate networks. As cyber threats evolve, some are suggesting that cybersecurity ratings are poised to become as important a factor as credit ratings, making failure to implement a professional cyber resilience program more than reputational risk. A thoughtfully designed cyber resilience program will become not only a competitive advantage, but a requirement for sustained growth. Think back again to that Toll case study. MIT and Sloan suggest that there should be a 4-phase stage to a cyber resilience framework: preparation, detection, response and recovery that can enhance an organisation's capacity to sustain operations through a cyber attack while minimising both disruption and reputational harm. The COVID crisis exposed some organisations' lack of business continuity planning, but has also shown how fast some companies and governments can and have moved to digital business models and remote ways of working. Previous reasons for not being able to do certain tasks digitally have overnight been brushed aside with the digital first as the only solution to be COVID safe and remote working. The dramatic shift has shown again how critical our digital backbone is to our economy. Early in the pandemic, the AWIA launched with support from Federal Ministers Andrews and Fletcher the Australian Business Continuity website, which gave access to businesses the free tools, platforms and resources to enable businesses to move online at speed and safely. Unfortunately, for many of our SMEs in particular, cybersecurity and cyber resilience is seen as an afterthought. And when industry supply chains are becoming increasingly connected between businesses, we require better cyber hygiene. In the initial stages of the pandemic, before the curve was flattened, governments were seeking industry feedback on the effects of COVID-19. Governments wanted to know the impact on three key areas: jobs, future investments, and supply chains. AWIA surveyed members, and this formed part of our IP for our white paper. Governments were especially keen on any data and insights that provided leading indicators or shone a light on what was happening in the economy closer to when it was happening. We needed to move quickly, and so we wrote a white paper called Building Australia's Digital Future in a Post-COVID World in around 6 weeks, so we could ensure that governments could use it as a valuable input to their active decision making. The 50-page report provides over 40 recommendations, which we grouped into short, medium and long term. Pleasingly, some of the recommendations have already been adopted by governments. We do have a focus with a dedicated chapter on the white paper on cybersecurity, cyber skills development and cyber resilience, as well as looking more closely at the key industry of transport and its cyber resiliency. The pandemic highlighted to policymakers and governments the importance of secure supply chains, both internationally and domestically. The role of our transport and freight system was shown to be critical, yet the data and insights on our supply chain systems is not what it could be, and the resiliency of the network needs to be looked at with fresh eyes when operations at ports and distribution centres are becoming increasingly connected and subject to cyber attacks that could shut down ports and distribution centres as they become increasingly automated. So we know that many SMEs have become increasingly digitised virtually overnight to move their businesses and workforces online as a result of COVID. So Australian SMEs contribute 57% to Australian GDP, and they're a significant contributor to private sector employment, yet they were least prepared for business continuity from the pandemic and the resultant increase in cyber threats. Small businesses are target of 43% of cybercrime, with over 22% of small business affected by ransomware unable to continue operating. Smaller organisations do not have the cyber skills to support them in comparison to the larger counterparts, which may reduce their ability to compete. Moving operations online has exposed them to existing and new cyber threats. One recommendation is the federal government's 2020 cybersecurity strategy looks at cyber resiliency, which we understand is not in its current remit, as well as we suggest government look at incentives to upskill and support SMEs' cybersecurity requirements. The Australian Cybersecurity Strategy Action Plan 2016 called for strong cyber defences to ensure networks and systems are hard to compromise and resilient to cyber attacks. However, it does not extend to support business continuity and resilience. As such, we're calling the 2020 strategy to go to issues of resiliency rather than just security. Of course, since we released the paper, cybersecurity has become front and centre for the federal government, as well as the New South Wales government's welcome $240 million announcement the Minister talked about earlier in cyber capability and skills, with a regional push, all of which we fully support, of course. The Industry Advisory Panel to the 2020 strategy released its cybersecurity report last week, and it supports a number of our white paper recommendations, with its report suggesting 5 key policy pillars: deterrence, prevention, detection, resilience, and investment. So finally, this is my last slide to be pleased to know. I'd like to finish on standards and this task force. The AWIA is pleased to be able to support the work of the New South Wales Government and Minister Dominello, AustCyber and Standards Australia. We see global standards and harmonisation of standards as critically important to our industry. Australia is not a cyber island, and what is a hyper-connected digital world? Businesses are increasingly adopting cloud-based technologies, and COVID accelerated this change, and we see adoption of new digital technologies and business platforms by both government and industry as a really positive development. Cyber standards are global issues, and we should leverage existing international capabilities and standards wherever possible. However, we also need to address the basics. Many data breaches and attacks can easily be prevented by basic cyber hygiene being applied. We saw earlier about the weakest links to the human element, so I think we can do some basics to really lift the standards. Finally, supply chain security is important, as the system is only as strong as the weakest link. We've seen this in the defence contractor space for many years, where a small company with lax cyber arrangements is targeted over the more sophisticated government agency or larger company. In the same way kids are not allowed to school unless they are vaccinated, a similar approach should apply to businesses that interact. Proving you have taken the basic steps to address your cyber hygiene should become expected. Australia now has a digital economy, The result of this important standards harmonisation work, I hope, will lead to greater understanding of the importance of cybersecurity and resilience across industry. Normalising where possible standards and setting a cyber standards benchmark will lift capability to ensure we have a secure supply chains and a secure economy. Thank you very much.
Right. Some early questions, and here's an early one from Cyrise. Thanks. Good to see the Cyrise team here. How do we support the strategy and the task force itself? So what's your main message to industry and to the audience here? And maybe Minister, give that question to you. What would you like the support to be to this particular task force from industry?
Oh, look, obviously the most important thing is to identify the pain points and then the solutions. Like it's very easy to identify pain points. Like agencies tell me all the time what the problems are, but I ask them, so what are your solutions? So they're the two big things. And if you could feed that into the task force on the various issues, whether it's again prioritisation, regionalisation, harmonisation, then that would go a long way to making sure we can get through this faster than normal.
I always say that to my staff, give me the solution, not the problem first. I suppose there's another key one in terms of the engagement for standards. There's a question here, will Australians who contribute already to international standards be invited to the task force as well? Obviously, there's a lot going on in this and a lot of contribution. Maybe Jed, over to you.
Yeah, no, great question, and the answer is yes, and that'll happen through one formal liaison to the actual committee on cybersecurity within Standards Australia. The second thing you'll be happy to hear is in terms of the task force, you also have people contributing to Simon's point, to the Minister's point, around resilience. So I've actually gone and reached out to them last week, and those people who are helping write global standards with the UK and Canada and the like are actually going to be part of the fold. So yes is the short answer. The thing I would ask people to do themselves to be proactive, as the Minister said, is to reach out to both myself or Prerana, who you can contact quite easily, and insert yourself in the mix, because you will be invited to the roundtables. We will engage you. You absolutely have a place to contribute, so please do.
Just sort of a segue to that question, and for Prerana as well, there's also a question here from South Australia. You did touch on other states and this body of work, and obviously we're talking to Standards Australia as well. What is the framework for reaching out to other states, and how would other states or parties be involved? And along with that, there's also a presentation on the frameworks. There's interest in how they can have input into the framework. So I suppose the best way to reach out in this regard.
Yeah, look, and that's a great question, actually. So what we're finding already with some of the sectoral roundtables and task forces that we've set up, that we're having conversations with, is that those individuals are really from across Australia. And so one way of being able to provide input is, for example, on the Defence Roundtable, given that South Australia has got quite a cluster down in South Australia, that could be one mechanism. But I think probably towards the end of our roundtable sessions, and when we are kind of reporting to the task force itself, perhaps at that point we can certainly open up an opportunity for us to be able to talk to the other state and territory governments and get them on board. I'm actually going to throw across to the Minister, because I know that the Minister has also been thinking about how he might be able to utilise some of the committees that he's on at that national level as well, to be able to influence and take questions.
Yep. Thanks, Prerana. So I'm a member of the Australia Data Digital Council, and I know that since the National Cabinet has been formed, I know the Prime Minister has indicated that he'd like to see that moving forward, and he's interested in basically getting rid of a whole lot of the other COAG style councils and try and drive everything as much as we can through the National Cabinet. But he did indicate that there's a preference for the Data and Digital Council to keep going in some form because of the importance in the work it's doing. So I'll definitely agitate this through the Data Digital Council, which Minister Stu Robert chairs from a federal level, but I've got my counterparts in states and territories. And I know that this is going to be important, because the problem with cyber is at a federal level, for example, there's about 4 different ministers that have a play in it. So, and when it's broken up into different pieces like that, it's hard to get leadership on it. So I'll try and drive it through that body.
Thank you very much. And there's another question, which an interesting one could be for Simon as well. Pursuing, in terms of the task force, pursuing controls or SLA frameworks, service level agreements, or the control frameworks. Simon, maybe on behalf of industry, where do you think industry would be thinking? Would they prefer controls? Of the word regulation has been touched on, but yeah, just controls or service level agreements. How do you think industry would best fit around that type of framework, or which one?
Yeah, look, thanks for the question. I think Jed gave a very good overview of where Standards Australia's approach goes to these issues, and we certainly support that from an industry perspective. We want to take global standards and use those wherever possible. Well, obviously, many companies work across international boundaries, and what you don't want is to have different standards in one country and another standard in another country. Like, we don't want to have different standards in New South Wales and in South Australia. So harmonise that, and across industries, which is what we're trying to do here. So the short answer is we don't want a regulatory approach. We think government's taking a risk-based approach to cyber, and data sovereignty and all these sorts of issues that are very topical at the moment is the right approach. And certainly leveraging global standards and harmonising them is what we would seek from industry. We don't want to have a sort of overly prescriptive regulatory approach.
Prerana, you mentioned the cybersecurity maturity model is being adopted. That's been adopted at the US defence level as well. Is that something you think everyone should be looking at and having an understanding of that particular model? That seems to be a real driver, particularly if you're going to be touching on the defence industries at all.
Yeah, look, absolutely. If you're interested in selling to defence or potentially any government agency in the US, then the CMMC will likely be put on as the minimum requirement. So absolutely take a look at it. We'll be actually throwing up a seminar, I think it's tomorrow morning, in fact. So
I think it is, yes.
Yeah, so absolutely tune in and listen in on, and if you've got any questions, just come to us and ask. But that is definitely one of the areas that we'll be considering as part of the Defence Roundtable Task Force.
Great. One other question I've got. There is no other questions from the. Oh, here. Just at the moment you say there's no questions, and they all come. I've got one question from the media. There was a report came out, I think last week, that the media sector is also being subject, because obviously the media, people are going to media websites and there's a vulnerability there. Are you looking at running a media roundtable at all in this? I'll raise that both from the awareness, the language that is used by media, the way that journalists report on cybersecurity, getting rid of the hoodie approach and treating it as a business and digital risk approach. I'm seeing nodding. Who would like to take that one?
Look, I'm happy to dive in, and our response to these questions has been yes, because Prerana and I think everyone on the task force and the Minister, we want to get things done. And so if there's an appetite there, we're happy to talk to you. I should add, we've actually stolen some of Simon's wording because it's so great around digital backbone. So you mentioned the media, but we've actually gone into cloud, and so to look at what does that mean? Data centres, a big thing for the New South Wales government. So we've actually, grown in terms of our focus, and we would welcome a media discussion too. Absolutely.
Right. Well, look, we're down to the final minutes. There's one more question here touching on GDPR, and there's a few more, and I think that's something we'll come back to. It's a bigger discussion that we're going to have, considering we've only got down to the last few minutes. Minister, I think a closing statement, in fact, depending on how long you would like, I can give that over to each of you, but maybe just a call to action. What would you really like to see? And I suppose what should the expectation be of outcomes from this task force?
Oh, well, thanks, Chris. Like, I want this task force to be ambitious. Like, this is so important to the future success of our nation. I can't emphasize it enough. Like, when you're looking around the world in terms of where the giants are moving, it's all in the digital space. If we don't anchor this down as a bedrock for our success moving forward, then we have absolutely wasted an enormous opportunity for our great nation. So please give it your best efforts and be as ambitious as humanly possible, because I can tell you from a New South Wales government perspective, we backed you in with $240 million worth of money, and we're as ambitious as you allow us to be. So please give it your best.
Great. Well, $500 million is a good way to start for the rest of this year. Look, we're going to close on that. I think for the audience, there are some handouts there available that you can download. We have a copy of the AWIA, Building Australia's Digital Future in a Post-COVID-19 World. We have the Digital Trust Report from AustCyber, the recent report that was mentioned, IAP's report on the Australian cybersecurity strategy is there, and also worthwhile having a look at the 2020 Defence Strategic Update. It does talk about industry and industry capability development. Take the opportunity while there's 1 or 2 minutes to go just to write in any other comments or questions for the panel that we can follow up later. We also run the Cybersecurity Weekly podcast. We've had Ron Gucci there, the AWIA, and I have been watching the AWIA for some time, and you're getting much more active, and I think good on you. Just keep going in terms of for your membership. We had Prerana on our webcast last week. We are running an India series, and if you want to get some insights into what the New South Wales government is doing, both in India, we had Mr. Rohit Manchanda, the Trade and Investment Commissioner to India, and he speaks very obviously pushing the New South Wales government startup community here in cybersecurity, very worthwhile listening to. There's also a copy of the Cyber Risk Leaders magazine available to you. And for tomorrow, talking about standards, we're looking at technical auditing standards in this India series, bringing India, Australia and the ASEAN region with a link in there to Malaysia, really looking at what those standards are. And Simon mentioned getting that regional approach, and that's how we take it. So look, on that note, we are going to finish right on time. Thank you very much to the Honourable Victor Dominello, the Minister for Customer Service for the New South Wales Government, Prerana Mehta, the Chief of Ecosystem Development for AustCyber, Dr. Jed Horner, the Strategic Advocacy Manager for Australian Standards, and Simon Bush, the General Manager for the AWIA. Thank you very much for joining us on this particular session. And we will end on that note. The recordings will be available, and have a look at the socials coming out of that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.